philosophical discussion. Today's episode, I'll be debating Foot Soldier on whether it is right to mandate restrictions in relation to the coronavirus pandemic. So if you're interested in that debate, then stick around because I'm going to be arguing that we should have restrictions and that we are justified in mandating those restrictions. And Foot Soldier will be taking the opposition. So yeah, it should be an interesting discussion to say the least, and obviously very relevant for today's society, considering over 100,000 people have died in the UK as of today. So considering the ethical urgency of the matter, I think that is something that we should all be talking about. So yeah, I'm going to be joining Arthuria now, and yeah, we're going to get into the discussion. Okay. Hello. So I'm live, guys, just to let you know. And yeah, I don't know if you're ready for your discussion.
Hi, man. How's it going? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, man. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Not spoke for a while.
I know it's been a while. Well, you've been just MIA. And people in my chat have even been like, where's Foot Soldier been? So...
Yeah, I moved country, moved house, obviously. And I've been renovating a villa and been doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
so, been very busy.
I saw the pictures of the renovations and you were saying you were doing your house out. It looks nice. Like obviously, look, that's cool. Like you're doing that sort of stuff. Where have you went to? Is it like Spain?
No, it's Italy.
Italy. Ooh, fancy.
Yeah. So a lot of work to do, and I also just like lost a bit of motivation on social media. The end of last year, I don't know. It was just, I guess, it wasn't really. I don't know what it was. I just run out of steam really. I was just like, why am I doing this? Like, what's the point? Does anyone care? And then I was just like, oh, I'll just have a break. But now I've got like more enthusiasm again, and I've got an idea for a video.
I think that we just got moved, and that's why we got cut off there. Yeah, I think you got cut off there mid-sentence. You were saying now you got enthusiasm back.
Yeah, a bit more. So I'm going to try and get a video up at some point soon.
Yeah, man. It would be nice to have you back. Obviously, the vegan community needs as many people on board as possible. So I think that certainly with how many people especially have dropped off over the past, like year or two with with ex-vegans. Obviously, I know you're not an ex-vegan. At least if you are an ex-vegan, then this is going to change the debate entirely.
Oh, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm an ex-vegan in terms of the clickbait for my next video. But
no, that's cool. That's cool.
But, yeah, man. So today's debate is going to be an interesting one, and interesting in discussing it with you, man, because it's quite an interesting. There's been a lot of vocal people, Peter Hitchens, Nigel Farage, a lot of very vocal people in the political arena on the restrictions. So it would be interesting to get a debate happening on this, because I've not really seen that many people debate this topic. Although this is it's
because it's scandalous. That's why.
Yeah, it's a very hot topic right now, of course, but I haven't seen any debates, not in this server, on it, and yeah.
Yeah, and obviously it's your prop, and you're going to be arguing that we are in principle wrong for mandating restrictions in relation to coronavirus. Is that right?
Yeah, so the prop verbatim is compulsory coronavirus restrictions such as curfews, social distancing, forced business closures, and travel bans are immoral in principle.
Right. And why would you say that was the case?
Well, I've prepared an intro speech, if you want to hear that, and that will just introduce everything, hopefully,
100%.
in a nice way, and then we can go from there, freeform. But I'll read the whole thing first, and then we can get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to let everyone know who's watching this debate is taking place on Arthuria, which is a debate server. So if you're part of the YouTube community and you're in my chat, then you can check out Arthuria. The link will be in the description in a second. And I think Twisted Hippie, one of my mods, has just posted that into the chat. So yeah, check out Arthuria. Anyway, continue. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, nice one, man. It's good to drop the name of the server, because it's the place to be if you want to do any debates. This is, I think, the best like civil debate server on Discord right now. So check
However,
out Arthuria. So yeah, I'll get into my introductory statement. It's not super long, medium. So the proposition, as I said, compulsory coronavirus restrictions such as curfews, social distancing, forced business closures, and travel bans are immoral in principle. So in all jurisdictions with due process, for a crime to be committed, it requires both a mens rea component, the guilty mind, and an actus reus component, the guilty act. The only exception to this are strict liability laws. However, I'm prepared to argue that strict liability laws are unethical as they violate a human right, namely the nulla poena sine culpa principle, which means no punishment without fault. Strict liability laws do not even exist in countries like Germany, as Article 7 of the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms establishes this principle as a human right. So strict liability laws are arguably unethical themselves as they violate an established human right. In common law jurisdictions such as the UK, Canada, Australia, India, Kenya, Pakistan, Philippines, South Africa, New Zealand, Nigeria, Ghana, Israel, and America, it's the component of actus reus contingent on a mens rea component, which establishes criminality. So this is why thought crimes are not actually real crimes, because they lack a component of actus reus. And this is why crimes which lack mens rea, such as running someone over when driving carefully down the road, if someone jumps out in front of your car, for example, that's not a criminal act either. So inadvertently spreading seasonal flu is not a crime, but if you went up to someone and maliciously injected someone with influenza virus, that would be a crime. And if you have any transmissible disease at all and maliciously spread it to others, then of course that would be a crime. Likewise, if someone knows they have coronavirus and decides to go out on public transport and cough at people, then that's obviously a crime, because there exist the two elements, both criminal components, the mens rea and the actus reus. But if someone does not have coronavirus, it's impossible to spread it. So unless someone was committing some other crime, like just being a public nuisance by pretending to have coronavirus and coughing on people, which would be a crime because it would be, being a public nuisance or disturbing the peace or something, criminalizing travel for people without coronavirus cannot possibly be, it can't be a criminal act because there's no actus reus component. So banning travel is simply just a human rights violation. Traveling whilst asymptomatically and unknowingly having coronavirus lacks mens rea, and so can't be a criminal activity either, because you need both the mens rea and the actus reus. So whether it's okay and fully advisable to inform the public about the risks of coronavirus, saying that it's respectful to prevent of transmission by limiting social contact, it's not consistent with the principles of law to criminalize basic freedoms when it has not been established that someone has coronavirus. So you can't say that someone's committed a crime when there's not a lawful basis to establish that with the two components of law. So as well, if it's violating a human right to get to breaking that law, then there's something fundamentally wrong with that as well. So what I would say is, to sum up that was just like a nice introduction to what I'm going to be arguing, but I can just come up with a really simple syllogism. Violating human rights is unethical. Coronavirus restrictions violate human rights. Therefore, coronavirus restrictions are unethical. And I can say how it's unethical in a deontological framework and in a utilitarian framework, and we can get into all that juicy stuff. But that's basically my intro. So perspective, if you've got any thoughts on some of that, then maybe we can get started.
Yeah. Obviously, the legal terminology isn't my forte in terms of like when we talk about the law. When I'm talking about the law, I would usually use obviously ethical terminology and talk about why we have the law. And I'm glad that you related it back to human rights, because obviously when you made the argument, it's obviously not based on whether it would be justified in legislation, which is a secondary position in relation to whether it would be justified under the concept of law, but whether it would be justified in general, and whether it would be then, whether it is the law's place to allow for such things. That's fair enough. Like, I can talk about the concept of law and whether the concept of law is applicable to the coronavirus restrictions in relation to something like human rights is absolutely fine. What I couldn't talk about would be the legal, as in our judicial system, and how it functions in there. So if you're looking for a debate that would like outline not just the moral principles, but something more akin to the UK judicial system and the way it functions, I'm not qualified to do that. And that's just not something I have the information to provide. But I will say, in relation to the coronavirus restrictions and whether you are justified in restricting someone's freedom for a moral principle, I would argue that we are justified in restriction of freedoms for the greatest expression of subjectivity, and that the expression or the transmission of coronavirus is such a threat that the risks of not taking these actions could trespass upon the subjectivity of the general population, and therefore be an act of recklessness on the part of the individual who doesn't wear a mask or abide by restrictions. And so I would make the comparison akin to not wearing a seatbelt or reckless driving. Now, from what I'm aware, you don't need to have committed the crime in relation to crashing a car. There doesn't have to be any physical consequence for reckless driving. Reckless driving has more to do with the principles of which the individual is driving, the way in which the individual is driving, and their ability to abide by certain structures of allowed behavior. And it's the same thing with wearing a seatbelt. You don't have to go into a car crash and then be hurt to be convicted for not wearing a seatbelt. You can be told off for not wearing a seatbelt because we would say that was by and large irrational. And that's what I would say. I would say that not abiding by coronavirus restrictions is by and large irrational. That the individual is, when they breach these restrictions, is restricting their subjectivity by overall impeding the ethical function of society.
Okay. Yeah, so some interesting points there, but I think there's maybe more agreement in there than really a point of contention. Because, for example, not wearing a mask. Let's say I decided to flout the restrictions and not wear a mask and go around coughing and being really rude and not respecting the social distancing recommendations and stuff like this, then that would just be akin to being like generally antisocial anyway, like going up to someone and burping in their face or like farting in them or something like this. Like it would just generally be disrespectful in a sort of social understanding of the situation anyway. But what I mean, for example, is let's take a restriction such as a travel ban. Here in Italy, for example, if right now, basically the whole country has got various restrictions, and the restriction, one of the restrictions here is you can't leave your comune, which means like basically like your what's it like your town or something. But it's not like a town; it's more like a county. Yeah, you can't like leave. Let's say a county.
Okay. You can't leave your county.
And so if I want to go, for example, to IKEA or the hardware store to pick up something, I have to cross over my comune into the other one, and if I get stopped, I can get 450 euro fine for doing that. Yeah. But I need to get some shit, but I'm not allowed because of these arbitrary restrictions. Does it matter if I go 5 minutes in that direction? I'm wearing a mask and being respectful. I'm respecting.
Why do you think it's arbitrary?
Well, it's not arbitrary in terms of, obviously they've done it in order to, they've said you can't leave your community because they don't want people to go around all the country to spread coronavirus around different parts, and they want to isolate, they want to lock down and isolate as much to limit spread. There's an argument to be had whether that actually really has been effective or not anyway. But that's not something I want to really argue, because
you said
I
in
can
principle.
just grant that. Yeah, I can just grant that all of the lockdown measures, all of the restrictions, they all make sense, right? But what I'm arguing is not that it doesn't make sense. I'm arguing that in order to legally enforce, make it a criminal offence and fine people for not wearing a mask on, for going 5 minutes away from their house in the car to go to the hardware store, or things like this, then that is a violation of fundamental human rights.
How?
And so that is therefore unethical if you grant that human rights violations constitute something which is unethical. I'm assuming you agree that a human rights violation is unethical, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially since when I would talk about rights, I think it's funny, the German word. I mean, you're fluent in German, aren't you? So when you it's like when we talk about rights, it's very different in English than it is in German, for example. Right doesn't necessarily mean what is right for just an individual or a group, but the system as a whole.
Yeah.
And I would say that there was no breach in right in terms of coronavirus restrictions, and that it's actually the respecting the rights of individuals, the right to life, for example, the right to healthcare or adequate healthcare even.
But there's a difference between, right, so what I'm trying to highlight here is if you went around coughing in people's faces, or you didn't wear a mask deliberately and didn't respect the social, the new social norms in place, deliberately flouted all of that because you wanted to be a public nuisance, then I would say you've got every right to arrest that person or fine that person because they're committing an offence. Because there's, I started off by talking about the legal side of it, and it's important because the legal side, although what is ethical is not what the law says. The law tries to do what is ethical. So by drawing from the law to indicate what is ethical is sort of putting the cart before the horse. So we need to discuss what is ethical before we just point to the law and say, look what the law says. But the reason why I'm using the law is because the law, how it is derived from ethics. And there's an old understanding in ethics of these actus reus and mens rea principles of the guilty mind and the guilty action. So that's why there's codified human rights, for example, in Article 7 of the Human Rights Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, that establishes the principle of no punishment without fault. So, like, that's the nulla poena.
I don't think it's meant to be a punishment. I don't think that this is considered an act of an act of punishment or act of it's not. It's nothing but. It's deliberate. If anything, it's like, think of it as like traffic laws. It's like they're not punishments. Like the speed limit, it's not a punishment. So you don't need to consider someone as...
The speed limit's not a punishment, but the fine is a punishment.
The fine's a punishment, yeah. Well, it's the same with coronavirus restrictions. It's like if you break the restriction, you get a fine. The restriction's not the punishment.
Yes.
The restriction's the codified boundary of human action, and upon which, if you break, you will receive a punishment. So
I agree with that.
So if you agree with that, so when you say that, obviously in terms of the guilty mind versus the guilty action, coronavirus restrictions aren't in relation to individuals going around coughing on people's faces. Actually, the whole point is that we could all be behaving as safely as we thought was right, based on our caprice. So we could be, acting as normal if we thought so, but respectful of each other. We could even be wearing face masks, just sat right next to each other. We could be meeting up with as many people as we want, but that wouldn't necessarily represent what was actually beneficial to public safety or necessary for the continuation of our health service, and obviously, and what would be mandated for like public safety in the first place. So, like, remember that, like, it's not about whether someone is guilty of a crime when we are applying these restrictions. It's about what is the whole point of law, which is the expression of subjectivity. And I would say that we are respecting human rights fundamentally when we place these restrictions on the public. We aren't breaching them.
Right, but the problem is there's a conflict of rights because I've got the right to travel as a human right, but I've also got the right to life as a human right. So
Yes.
there's a conflict of rights here. So you're saying that because I've got the right to life, I need the coronavirus restrictions are justified and ethical. But I'm saying because I've got the right to travel, the coronavirus restrictions are a violation of a human right and unethical. So, but the way in a deontological system that when two rights are simultaneously violated, there's been various philosophers proposing various different solutions. I think we can go with like a Reagan-esque solution of collapsing into a slightly utilitarian perspective and saying, well, the like a mini ride principle, for example, the least harm principle, or the least amount of people harmed principle. And the thing is with the travel bans, for example, if you're going to completely restrict my life when I know I don't have
It's
coronavirus,
not that
but
bad
it's
that you can't go to IKEA.
well, I can't go anywhere. I can't crack on. I'm breaking restrictions every time I go to the hardware store because I have to go out my commune. Like, it's as simple as that. So it's like I'm literally doing a criminal act.
Is
Apparently,
this what you really want to be saying right now on on the internet? It's a good thing we're not speaking Italian.
yeah. But no one knows who I am anyway. That's the point. Why
Oh, that's
that's why
true.
I'm.
That's true. That's
But yeah, like every time I want to grab a new bit to renovate my house, I have to break the law essentially to travel 5 minutes out of my town and risk a 400 and however much euro fine. And
you wouldn't be able to order this stuff online.
no, you can't really order it. I guess potentially you could, but I don't know, maybe.
Well, then why aren't you?
Like it's just like I don't know if you've ever sort of like done renovations or something. You need a specific, you need the specific masonry angle grinder plate, and it has to like be the correct one. So you go to the hardware shop and there's like 10 different ones, and you have to pick the right one. If you buy it online, you're inevitably going to buy the wrong one. It's not going to fit, or it's going to be too big or too small or too something else. You're going to have to send it back and have to order another one. And so really, you maybe theoretically could get everything online, but it's just really, really impractical to do that.
Yeah, it might be impractical, but then it's like, why would it be justified to, let's say, like, one, like, don't get me wrong, I can empathize with you needing to do home renovations and shit. Like, obviously there are stuff that's like essential for your basic survival and basic like well-being. And I wouldn't be surprised if there would if that sort of thing should be codified. Like if you've got to, like, you know, for example, leave your area for like a necessity, but like that, I think that's if I'm honest, I think that you could probably like get away with ordering them online. I think like I've ordered hardware stuff online before, but then I know that it can be iffy. But what I would say is that if you can, it's like if you can, then you should order it online. If you can't and it's a necessity, then yeah, I think you'd be justified in like obviously respecting yourself in relation to the law. And it's like, then I would say it's a point of tragedy in which you're having to break the law in order to respect your own subjectivity. You know, you'd ultimately be placing yourself at undue risk if you didn't. You know, like for example, if you're going to be without heating or electricity or something like that would be like a real big thing. But in case of like if we're talking like aesthetics, for example, order it online. If it doesn't work, send it back, order a new one. That kind of thing. And I would also say, like, look, like if we're talking about respecting human rights, like, are we going to talk about where human rights come from? Are we going to talk about how, and when we talk about resolving duty and you saying falling into a utilitarian framework, I'm certainly not going to do that ever. I think utilitarianism is terrible. I'd rather fall into a pit of vipers than fall into utilitarianism.
Well, I'm glad we agree on something strongly there.
Well, and so like honestly, what I would say is that in relation to how we should resolve duty, I'd say it's against the expression of subjectivity, and in relation to that, I would say, like, at which point is subjectivity being violated to the greater degree? Like, which right is more important to the respect of subjectivity? Is it the right to life, or is it the right to travel? And obviously, we're going to say the right to life, primarily because you need to be alive to travel even. So, obviously it has to take precedence. The right to life typically takes precedence over everything else. Right to healthcare is another big one because it's basically the right to life, but extended towards a certain level of mandated well-being. And then obviously we can talk about obviously mental health in relation to like restrictions and not being able to leave your house and so on, which is, I think, an important aspect of things. But ultimately, when we talk about human rights, what we should be understanding is human rights are in relation to what is the expression of subjectivity in terms of humanity. And when we talk about restrictions in relation to coronavirus, I see the restriction of individuals in terms of let's say mandated social distancing as providing a necessary codification for those actions that must be undertaken. Otherwise, we would place public health at risk and undermine general access to medicine and adequate healthcare and the right to life. And would you deny that?
Look, the thing is, my point here is not to argue that we shouldn't wear masks. We should go wherever we want. We should have parties all the time. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the science has said we should limit. We should socially distance and stuff like that. So if you don't want to be a dick, then maybe you should do that. But what I'm arguing in this debate is not that we should throw parties and go to the biggest raves possible, but the idea is that in principle criminalizing certain basic freedoms and fining people and putting restrictions on people's freedoms by force of law, by actually using state enforced monopoly violence, that is the problem, not the fact that you're a bit of a dick if you don't respect them. Like, I've got nothing wrong with respecting the coronavirus sort of recommendations.
You prefer recommendations or guidelines rather than like codified like laws, like rather than like But then why not traffic? Why don't we treat traffic violations like that? Like, oh well, you should drive in your lane, but it's not a crime unless you crash into someone. Like things like lane discipline, speed limits.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's like the thing is with traveling, I can do whatever I want on the bike or using my own 2 feet. That's absolutely fine until I cause a problem, and then I might get pulled up and be like, "Why were you being a dick? Explain yourself." But if I am operating a motor vehicle that has got where that's a dangerous activity, and you need to be competent in order to do that. There's a lot of regulation around it, and it's not your right to operate a motor vehicle that you buy. Like, it's not my right to operate whatever the hell I want to do. If I want to do certain protected activities, I need to have a license to do that, and I need to obey by certain rules. That's just contract law, right? So, for example, just with contracts generally, if I make a contract that I'm going to do this and I don't do that, I'm in breach of contract, and then that is that's an offense. I'm doing something wrong. It's not a criminal offense; it's a civil offense, right? So I've got nothing wrong with, like, if I sign a contract saying, for example,
I don't think it's not a civil offense to like be a reckless driver, for example. It's a criminal offense.
Yeah, no, but if I have a contract specifically, it would be, and I breach that contract, it would be civil. But yeah, with driving, it would be a criminal offense. But the thing is,
why would
when I apply for a license, I'm engaging into a contract with the state, with the DVLA in the UK or whatever.
And what I'm saying is that existing in the state is a level of personal responsibility that is expressed in driving and in operating within the street in general. Like, so for example, going around and juggling knives in a public space would be, again, another expression of endangering public safety.
Yeah, sure, but there's the two acts. There's the guilty mind and there's the guilty act, because you're juggling knives, which is dangerous, and there's kids running about, and you're doing something dumb, and you should get arrested, and that would be ethical to get arrested or to get detained, or for the police to come and tell you to.
But you'd be doing
stop
something
being a
dumb
dick.
you'll be doing something dumb if you're in a crowd. at a time when there's a global pandemic?
Well, you'd be doing something. It would probably not be advisable, and I wouldn't say that I would do that myself. Like go into
Mm-hmm.
a big crowd or go to a rave or something. I'd love to go to a rave, but I can't right now because it's a pandemic, and I'd be a dick if I did. So I'm not going to.
Mm-hmm.
But to criminalize music or to criminalize seeing your friends or to criminalize seeing like the classic example
No.
during this pandemic was someone went and picked up their mother from a care home because they were scared that she was going to die in the care home, and she got arrested for picking up her mother.
Okay.
Like that sort of thing
Mm-hmm.
is like you can't be deemed a criminal for picking up your mother.
I mean, we can say that it would be an exception because they're considering the actual safety and well-being of the individual that the law is trying to protect. But like, if we're talking about, for example, and like that might be an exception to the rule. But then we can talk about obviously whether there would be need to be exceptions to the rule. In terms of the rules themselves, though, like what is breaching human rights in the rules themselves? Like explain. Like I'm saying that they're respecting human rights, and I'll make an argument for that if you like. But before we get to that point, since the debate is in principle they are wrong, tell me why they are breaking human rights.
Well, yeah, sure. So, for example, I've got a right to travel, right? That's one of my human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry?
No, sorry. Continue.
Yeah, I just had some distortion. But yeah, so I've got a human right to freedom, and my ability to travel. Let's not talk about borders and visas, but yeah, my right to travel,
Mm-hmm.
human right to do that, which is instantly being violated when I can't leave the small allotted area, um, of the commune here, for example, with the travel restrictions. I'm instantly having my human right violated. But if I go out, um, even into a crowd, and I don't have coronavirus, there's no way that I'm violating anyone's right to life because I don't have coronavirus. What if I take a
Well,
test, the swab?
this is the thing. Like, we would say that like what you're doing is what would be a recklessly endangering act. So the whole point of like your P2 is like corona. Excuse me. Coronavirus restrictions violate human rights. Um, okay, so one, I don't think that like obviously it violates all human rights. It can be respecting human rights. So in terms of the actual syllogism, I'm not going to like break down on the syllogism because I hate fucking syllogisms as it is. So I would say that it doesn't necessarily follow in your argument like coronavirus restrictions violate human rights, therefore they are unethical, because we've just established that a violation of human rights can be justified in relation to respecting another human right. So it could not. It could be the rule of double effect. Coronavirus restrictions, protect human rights, and that's what I would argue, and that the violations are necessary steps in order to protect other human rights. Now, what you have to show, and I would say, not in relation to that syllogism or in general, you'd have to show that the human rights violation was of greater magnitude that you would respect an individual's right to travel over their right to life or over their right to healthcare. And in terms of obviously the individual's actions, we have to understand is that the individual's actions are being considered in relation to general public safety and what is applicable to mandating what is necessary to maintain our health service. So one of the biggest things is obviously coronavirus can go 14 days without being detected, as in you will not know you've got symptoms for 14 days. So unless you're taking a test every single day, the chances of you picking up coronavirus in the early stages and being unaware of it is unlikely. What's more likely to happen is you're going to go for a 10 to 14 day period with no symptoms, and then you're going to develop symptoms, and then in that time you'll have infected so many people. And what we're averaging now is about 1.1 to 1.4 people will be infected in relation to the R number in the UK at the moment. So that's every 10 people, 11 to 14 people. So that means exponentially you can let's say every 10 people infected, another 14 people infected, and every every time they infect another, they're infect to another 14. So it's exponential in terms of growth. And so it overwhelms the health service massively just by being even 10% more virulent. So like some of the new, for example, variants are 10 to 70% more virulent. And so the expectation is that they could overwhelm the health service in a matter of months. And by the time that we've even understood that this infection has been a massive outbreak, as in we are starting to get positive tests back, we are starting to get the information back that, this is actually something that we can't contain, it's already too late. We're already past the point of no return. And then the next coming 2 weeks to a month, we are going to see a massive spike and the overwhelming of hospitals. And that's already happened in some hospitals in the UK, where hospitals have had like 9-hour waiting times, no beds, and running out of oxygen, and people waiting in ambulances. And that's with the restrictions. So in terms of, I think we'd both agree that without the restrictions now, our health service would likely have been overwhelmed, in the UK at least. So what would you say would you not say that these restrictions are necessary to protect public health, or would you be happy to accept that?
I would say the restrictions, well, it's sort of arguable because there's various different people voicing different points of view. Like I've mentioned Nigel Farage, and
does he even count as a human?
Yeah, I can see that your political alignment probably isn't very aligned with Nigel Farage, but
No.
it's actually got some interesting things to say. But I'm not a massive fan of him myself either. But he's been very vocal. Obviously, he's going to be one of the more vocal voices, the contrarian voices there. But it's arguable whether some of the restrictions even work. And the thing is, though, I'm not arguing that it's fine to overwhelm the health system and everyone should just do what they want and go to parties. I'm not arguing anything of that kind. What I'm saying is, yes, we should probably say, look, stay at home as much as you can. These are the medical advisory things to do. Please be respectful. Please respect this. And it's a very social thing to do, to respect this, and very antisocial thing to do, to go around and do the opposite. But what I have a problem with, and what I'm arguing for this debate, is not that you shouldn't be a dick. What I'm arguing is that it's actually unethical to take away someone's basic human rights in order to enforce the restrictions. You should strongly advise, you should strongly suggest and say, look, don't be a dick, follow these guidelines, and we can all do this together. And this is a very social thing, and it's very antisocial to go against them. But the second you fine me 400 quid or call me a criminal because I go to the shop to get some basic stuff, like, it's gone crazy. And there's severe violations of human rights.
Okay.
For just in case, when there's no, like, let's even say I go to the lab today and get a test that says I don't have coronavirus, I still can't travel anywhere, right? Even if I have a piece of paper to certify to say that I haven't got coronavirus, right? I still can't go anywhere. So it's just like across the board, blanket, boom, you can't travel. We're going to take away all your bunch of your human rights just because we want to prevent the spread. Yes, we should prevent the spread, and we should all act together and be respectful and follow the guidelines. But it should be strongly advisory and a social effort. It shouldn't be a criminal offense to visit your family or something.
Okay, so what about in terms of like following the speed limit?
Well, the speed limit is something a bit different.
What if it was just more of a guideline? They're more like guidelines than actual rules,
because when I can't operate a motor vehicle without insurance and a license and an MOT and having paid tax, and I need all of these things to operate a motor vehicle because it is I'm entering into a contract with the state to drive on their property. So like the state roads, it's publicly owned, quote unquote, but I'm entering into a contract with the state in order to perform that activity.
I don't think it's that at all. I mean,
on my
like,
own land,
I think that's a
on
bit.
my own land. So
Sorry.
I'll just finish this last train of thought. On my own land, if I own, for example, a racing track in my garden because I'm very wealthy, I can drive a Ferrari or whatever the hell I want on my own land, and I can go as fast as I want on my own land because it's my own land. But when I'm driving on roads, I'm entering into a contract with the state, and I have certain duties and obligations in that contract, and it's breach of a contract if I go against that. So it's different. I'm not breaching a contract though when I walk out my front door without a mask.
I don't think that's it at all, if I'm honest. For example, like the public property argument, I could just say like, well, look, man, like everything outside your bloody house is probably public property. Like unless you've got a private road that leads all the way to the hardware store. Like obviously the paths are not going to be essentially owned by Foot Soldier. But like that's not the point. Like in terms of the risk that you take in your own property, like the risk with your own life, we can accept that like an individual is justified in taking certain risks with themselves, but not with others. Okay. Now the whole point of the coronavirus restrictions and the whole point of like road safety laws is that there is a public health risk with a certain action. If you were to take this risk could lead to a massively detrimental effect in terms of the healthcare system, and we have deemed that risk as unjustifiable. So in other words, it's not the actual passing of corona that's the crime, it's the risk that you could pass corona that is the crime, right? And if we accept that to be the case, then what the law is telling you is that there are justifiable and unjustifiable risks, right? And it is not up to your caprice to justify whether, to reason of whether it is justifiable enough for you to follow the guidelines. Like the difference between a guideline and a law is whether we would say like, okay, use your own reason, right? Like we strongly advise, but use your own reason. Well, I'm going to say this. One, I think that humans individualistically are irrational, right? I don't think that individuals by themselves, by and large, are capable of complex reasoning, holding themselves to that reasoning and making justifiable arguments, especially since they're not going through peer review. They're not, and a lot of the time they're not even, they're not even being questioned by another individual, right? Like, so for example, with you saying, people should follow restrictions, but then you yourself are saying you're breaking restrictions. You're saying that people should follow these guidelines in relation to public health and safety, but so long as they don't, impede their subjectivity to a greater overall degree. Well, if you leave that up to the individual, they're all going to come to different conclusions of whether they should or should not follow those guidelines, and they're going to be absolutely useless. And by the time that they actually, by the time we realize that the guidelines are useless, which wouldn't be very long at all, because people were breaking the law for the love of God, even with the enforcement, we would find that we were being overwhelmed. The point of the matter is, we are saying this is an unnecessary risk. Now, would you say that we are justified in preventing individuals from taking unnecessary risks with public safety in otherwise justifiable actions? So, for example, in terms of building codes, we would say that an individual who works up on a height or something should be using necessary PPE, or, working in a factory, we would say that there was necessary PPE restrictions. Even if they're working by themselves, or in a public space or something like that, there are certain things that they need to do to respect public safety, and we have mandated these, and we've mandated them precisely because we do not trust the individual to interpret the guidelines without correctly, as in like there is a right and a wrong way to behave in terms of risk. We've mandated that right and a wrong way. Now, it is true that there can be exceptions to the rule and that like rules aren't perfect, but by and by, these are the best things that we'll have in order to respect human rights. So I'm wondering why you're saying that it is breaching human rights in relation to travel bans, but not breaching human rights in relation to taking unnecessary risks if you travel. So how are they not respecting human rights?
Well, there was a lot of things in there. I'll try and unpack some of this. So, well, if you say that if you give me a travel ban, you've instantly violated my right to travel. But if I travel, let's say I go in my car, I cross the boundary to the next town, and I remain in my car, and I just want to drive about and sort of like get out the house and listen to some music in my car and then drive back. I have not done any unnecessary risk at all. I haven't done anything whatsoever to increase the risk of spreading coronavirus or to risk anything outside of traffic incidents. I haven't done anything at all. So, and if I go into a shop, then I'm going to wear a mask because it's the shop's policy that I wear a mask in their shop, and it's a private shop, so they can do what the hell they want. They can have whatever policy. They can say at the door, you can only enter if you're wearing a pink tutu. And if I don't wear a pink tutu, they trespass me. Or if I'm not wearing a mask, they trespass me. So that's absolutely fine. There's nothing unethical or wrong with that whatsoever. So if I go into a shop and it's their policy, wear a mask, I'm wearing a mask because otherwise I don't go in the shop because they will just trespass me. So there's nothing wrong with that. There is something wrong when you give a travel ban because you're instantaneously taking away one of my rights, and I'm not violating any right necessarily, right? In order to violate that right, I would have to then take additional action of additional risk to then unnecessarily violate someone's right to a hospital or something. If you want to make that argument of I could potentially spread it, it could potentially grow exponentially from the cases that I spread, and then that will overwhelm the hospital, and then that person gets sick. So then I'm depriving them of their right to healthcare. So you could take that angle, but you require extra steps to get to that. Whereas when you give a travel ban, you're instantaneously violating one of my human rights.
Right. I mean, you could there is an argument perhaps that could be made in terms of like whether we should allow individuals to, travel if they're not getting out their cars or something, and that could be done. It'd be just probably impossible to police, and I think that's probably why it's not the case. Probably not.
Right, but that's just a pragmatic objection, and that's not. There's no criminal component to that. Because otherwise you're going to get into thought crime territory and all sorts of weird territory. You're going to say, oh, you walking down the street, like just asking stop and search random people and just like search people's bags just in case, or do this just in case, or like people. 1.3 million people die each year from traffic accidents. So why don't we just ban driving just in case? Because 1.3 million people die each year. That's not such a dissimilar order of magnitude from the people who've died from the coronavirus pandemic in a year. So why don't we just ban driving? Because
it's probably no. I think that the difference is because it's like, so for example, if 3% of our population die of coronavirus, it's more like 10 to 30% need hospitalization, and obviously it grows exponentially in terms of how many deaths will actually happen if there are no ventilators provided to those individuals who require ventilation, which is like so many percentage of individuals who would otherwise be not in the deaths. So yeah, I think the whole point is that like whether we can provide individuals with adequate, like we can provide individuals in relation to road safety with adequate like medical care. Like if we have people driving on the roads, we can't provide people with adequate medical care if the infection spreads uncontrolled and if it spreads without essentially restriction. And so the restrictions are essentially in place saying like, look, if we don't act in this way as a unison public, like as in a society, if we do not behave this way, then we will ultimately have undermined our health service. Okay, these are our obligations individualistically in relation to a universal end. If we all apply this restriction, we will have this outcome. Now, if we start start like going into individualistic cases, it may or may not be the case that we need to go this far, or perhaps we need to go further. But it's no way to really know that. And that's what I would say, like, we apply from universal to individual rather than individual to universal. Like, it might be, we might apply the universal to the individual and come to a logical, conclusion that this is non-applicable for it's not good enough for mandating public health, or not a strong enough mandate, or it's too weak, or it's too strong. Like, these are the things that could come about through application. But in terms of overall mandating public safety, these like codified structures of duty basically outline what we must do in order to not breach the subjectivity of another. Now, that's what I'm arguing here. So you're saying that I would be breaching your subjectivity if we impose a travel ban. What I'm saying is, if we don't impose the travel ban, then we would be breaching the subjectivity of every individual in our society in relation to healthcare. And I would say that the right to medicine and the right to healthcare trumps the right to travel. Would you disagree?
It's a difficult one. You're saying, like, what is more important? Or it's one of those sort of like, would you rather be kicked in the balls or punched in the face sort of thing.
Would you rather lose a hand or be punched in the face? It's like, or would you rather lose a hand and be punched in the face? I think the answer is pretty obvious. Like, the right to travel versus the right to life, when the right to travel or the right to medicine are both pretty much dependent upon the infrastructure in place. So if we're infrastructure and where healthcare system becomes overwhelmed, then you're probably not, you're gonna quite quickly want to stay inside the house when individuals start having these risks and like when these consequences. Also, like, do you think this is the case of just coronavirus? Or would you apply the same logic to something like Ebola, for example? Much higher mortality rate. Let's say it was as virulent as corona. So let's say you go outside, you could pass on an infection that has a 50-50 chance of killing someone if you have it, or you could get an infection.
The thing with Ebola is, by the time you're infectious, you're already like severely ill, laying like down in a bed.
Okay, yeah, but let's say it's like corona in the sense that it has an incubation period.
Or if that was the case, the human race would go extinct within a matter of weeks.
Unless we're locked down. Like, if we found out, we'd have to lock that place down. Might even firebomb it, actually.
The whole human race would go extinct because no one, just a very small portion of the population are self-sufficient. And so everyone relies on these distribution networks to get their food and their basic infrastructure. If everyone had to stay in their house and they couldn't even go to the supermarkets, everyone would die of starvation. And if you went to the supermarket, you would just instantly get it if it was...
I said as virulent as corona. So that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, but so many people have already had it. Like, the amount of people who've asymptomatically had it is quite high. Like, give it another year or something. I don't know how long because I'm not a virologist, but give it some amount of time longer, and there will be herd immunity, because some people are arguing that there's problems with herd immunity because of reinfection, but that doesn't seem to be the case, because otherwise vaccines wouldn't work. An immune response is an immune response, whether or not it comes from a vaccine or from a natural...
what I'm trying to express here is, like, would you say you were justified in taking these risks if the risk was greater with individuals? Like, you had a 50% chance of let's say it was more virulent, or it had a higher mortality rate. Would these factors change the principles from which you judge whether they should be codified in law or not?
It would change everything, because if there was an Ebola pandemic which was as or more contagious as coronavirus, I would probably have no choice but to go and live in the woods, because I would die. I would just die, right? It would be extinction. I would be like, I would say goodbye to my family.
Let's say you could, in theory, survive if we locked everyone down. As in, like, we could save 25% of the population if we restricted everyone's freedom for a month. Would you be willing would you say that would be necessitated by law?
You couldn't, but what I'm saying is, you couldn't do it. You're giving me a hypothetical which
Look,
disregards
I'm
an
not.
important point.
I mean, like the whole point I'm trying to say is just imagine there was an infection, right? That was if we did not lock down for a month, would kill 25% of the population. Are we justified in keeping people in their houses? As in, like, if you leave your house, we will punish you.
Wait, if you don't leave your house, you die. You
No,
need to leave your house to get food, otherwise you
no.
die.
I'm saying, look, like, well, not necessarily. You could have food deliveries and stuff like that.
Yeah, but
And
then you
obviously,
get
lockdown implies really that you would only have to leave like once a day or something like that. You could only leave so many times a day or something, and that kind of thing. They did this in the UK, but the thing is, what I'm trying to express is, let's say you could have just food deliveries or something like that. You know, where like there's a food delivery guy going around. Essentially, there's a 25% of the population will die if we do not lock down. So we have the subjectivity, the entire subjectivity, the interests of 25% of the population, the entirety of their interests being weighed against the interest of 75% of the population's desire to leave their homes. Which one takes precedence?
Well, what I'm saying is the hypothetical you've raised assumes things which are contrary to what I'm trying to argue for, right? So I'll just unpack that. So essentially, let's just ramp it up. Let's say there's 100% mortality rate. If you catch this, you die, right? And it's as infectious as coronavirus. Well, if the delivery man comes, there's quite a high likelihood that you'll die. If you go to the supermarket and just go shopping once a day or once a week even, there's quite a high chance of likeliness that you'll die. And if such a high proportion of the population die, infrastructure will collapse and everyone will die, apart from the people who go and live in the forest. So you'd have to go and live in the forest, right?
Okay,
So
I know you want to live in the forest, yeah, right? But what I'm giving you as a hypothetical is not so extreme. And I'm trying to deliberately outline the extremities of this as being, if we do not lock down for a month, 25% of the population will die. Should we enforce that lockdown or not?
Before I answer that, I want to think about that a bit. But before I answer that, I've still got a problem with the hypothetical, because the problem with coronavirus is it's unsure. We're unsure whether the lockdowns are really that effective. Because when it's lockdown and people still go to the supermarket and people are still out and about and queuing up at tills and touching doorknobs and doing all this, people still get coronavirus anyway. The lockdowns may or may not be that effective, right? We don't know, because there's actually data coming out showing that that when the first lockdown was announced in England, the R rate fell immediately. But the problem with that is there's a lagging period, right? So it seemed that the R rate was already falling. No, the death rate was, sorry. And it seemed that the death rate was already falling, and then they went into lockdown, and
but
it didn't really
that's fair
affect
enough.
it that much.
But what you're talking about is like the coronavirus restrictions in terms of empirical data in relation to what's actually going on. Your debate was, in principle, the restrictions are wrong. Now, what I'm trying to understand is what restrictions you think are wrong and why, in principle. And so I gave you a hypothetical in relation to 25% of the population dying, and the restriction being the prevention of individuals from leaving their house. So what I was trying to work out is how you would balance the interests of 75% of the population against 25% of the population. And so this is really what the debate's about. At what level do we express the freedom of an individual in relation to the freedom of another? At what point do we see that an individual is responsible for another individual's subjectivity? And what I would say, as a state, we exist as one coexistent organism. We exist with one subjectivity, and that is to the greatest expression of the general population. Like, the greatest expression of everyone is the greatest expression of everyone, right? So if we have like 25% of the population will die, then if we don't imply these restrictions, then implying these restrictions is actually freeing us. It is a freedom. It is the rational thing to do, and it is the ethical thing to do. And so it is a respect of human subjectivity, of the well-being of individuals. Now, if you're saying that all the restrictions are wrong, or in relation to whether an individual is, right in being restricted for certain behaviors, I want to know why, and I want to know what the level of like restriction is in terms of like, do we allow 75% of the population to go outside and let 25% die? Would that be justified? Like, what is a justifiable restriction for you, and why is it justifiable? Like, what is the foundation, like the first principles of this ethical position in which you're saying we would be unjustified in allowing an individual to trespass upon another individual's rights, or like the state to mandate a behavior which I would argue would be the respect of human rights and human subjectivity?
Right. Well, there's a few things in there. Firstly, that was the most Orwellian thing I've ever heard you say. That restriction is freedom.
Oh no, it's Hegelian. It's
straight,
not even
straight from the
100%,
the
100%.
love,
Like
Ministry of Love.
no, well, it's honestly, it's like it's not an Orwellian thing. It's like understanding that laws are actually a respect of our subjectivity in the first place, only if they are rational laws.
Dude, you literally said that locking down would be freedom.
Yeah,
like restrictions, freedom.
Yeah, 100%. Like
that's Orwellian. That's
no,
so
no.
Orwellian.
Okay. Well, we can debate what freedom is. What do you take
That's
freedom to be?
Doublethink. That's like doublethink on a silver platter.
No, what do you think freedom is?
Well, freedom, right? So freedom and restriction are like antonyms, right?
Not necessarily, no.
Oh, come on, dude.
Do you have a theory of freedom?
A theory of freedom? I haven't thought about it. I'm just using my common English understanding of the word freedom,
which is probably freedom as being unrestricted. Normally, Hobbesian freedom is getting what you want.
Not necessarily getting what you want, but the right to not be impeded in the pursuit of something by
having... Hobbesian understanding of freedom. Okay, and in which case, the Hobbesian understanding of freedom takes your first order desires to be the fulfillment of your first order desires to be the expression of freedom. So, like, if you want chocolate and you manage to get chocolate, you are free. If someone stops you from getting chocolate, you are not free. If something else impedes you from getting chocolate, you are not free. Would you say that was the way? So those restrictions are like, you would say that would restrict your freedom?
No, I wouldn't say that. When we talk about first and second order choices, I wouldn't say that the first order is necessarily where the impediment has to come from, because then like you would just be going down like a silly reductio path if you said, oh well, actually if I want to drink alcohol but I don't care about the consequences, and my family prevent me from drinking alcohol, then they're destroying my freedom. Like, obviously not. That's like
so like you could see like they're restricting you from obtaining alcohol could be freeing you from your compulsion to drink alcohol.
Right, but that would be second order.
So a restriction can be freedom.
Restriction in it, yeah, but it's not. It's only when you split it up into first and second order. Let me think. It does say you are onto something, but it did initially sound rather Orwellian.
Yeah, I know it's not me. It's Hegel. That's why I was willing to argue it so easily, because this is just where I live. This is where I live.
Yeah. You do like to.
Hegel everything. Hegel, I've got Hegel on a t-shirt. I'm probably going to get Hegel on my Hegel tattooed on us or something, you know.
Yeah, I don't know about the tattoo. That's a bit extreme, but yeah.
See.
I've got a few things. I'm going to think about that a bit more. But what I want to touch on before we get to that is, because it might be an unnecessary avenue to go down. Because what I want to talk about a bit more is, can you remember that clap for the NHS shit that we did a while back?
Oh yeah, I think that's dumb as fuck. But I mean, like, don't get me wrong. Like, I think that's dumb as fuck. But like, yeah, and that wasn't like, obviously, like, if anything, like, it wasn't mandated, and if anything, it wasn't breaking restrictions because nobody was leaving their property and shit like that. Yeah,
no, but what I was going to say is it wasn't mandated, but everyone went out and clapped. Like, I listened out my window
Oh
at
yeah, it
like
was really
8.
popular, yeah. And it was just to show
Like,
solidarity in
everyone,
relation to the NHS, and I think it was probably more cathartic for individuals to feel the spirit of society on that side, like as if they were part of a greater overall purpose, which I think was actually the case. And maybe they just needed the visual and auditory expression of that.
right. And so people can get together and feel a social greater good and act in a certain way in accordance with that. So, and just based off of a mere suggestion on TV. So, um, wouldn't you say that people can get together and be strongly advised, like people were in Sweden, but without criminality involved, to wear a mask, respect 2 meters apart, not throw parties, social distance?
Honestly, I wish that I believed that people were capable of that in Britain. I don't. I think that most of the people, like I know a lot of people who broke lockdown in general, to have parties and stuff like that, and I think it's ultimately it's irrational. I think that if you are breaking, like restrictions, then you are acting irrationally. And I would say that, look, in terms of public health risk, there are certain times in which we mandate punishment in relation to certain risk taking activities. And I would say that there are times, and I think with the coronavirus, the risk to the coronavirus being so severe, the public health system being overwhelmed, I think mandating a punishment for taking that risk upon yourself, for judging your situation as being more important than the public good, then yeah, I would say that deserved punishment.
Right. Um, so let's say, for example, do you know about gifting in the gay community?
I can't say I do.
I'll just explain quickly. It's really something I find extremely dumb, but it goes on. So, in the gay community, people who have HIV sometimes get together and it's called gifting, giving someone HIV. So people opt to be infected
Yeah, I don't
with
think you can
HIV.
rationally do that. I would say that is a crime in many countries.
Right. So I, I just wanted to hear your take on this. So if someone wants nothing more than to be infected with HIV
Hmm.
through a homosexual act, and he wants nothing more than that to occur, and that will fulfill his greatest, deepest desires. Um, should that be criminal?
Criminal,
Should that be punished or prevented?
criminal, punishable. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
I would say so. Like for example, the restriction placed upon him would be akin to the restriction that we see with coronavirus. I would say that it would be an expression of his freedom to restrict him from the action of committing an act of self harm or an act of public endangerment in relation to coronavirus, and that's what I would be saying was the expression of law. So like we would be mandating, for example, codified laws of public safety in relation to the roads, which I think are also akin to coronavirus restrictions because it mandates a certain behavior, a certain restriction to an individual's behavior in the first place, which prevents overall harms to the subjectivity of individuals, and that's what the law is meant to respect: the expression of freedom. And I would say that in restricting certain freedoms, we can express freedom itself to a greater degree, which is why laws, if they are rational, are actually rational restrictions. They are actually expressions of freedom, which is why I would say, like, in telling people to lock down, let's say like if 25% of the population were going to die, you would be actually expressing subjectivity to the greatest degree. And I'll expand upon that for one simple thing, right? The way that we express subjectivity must be objective. And I would say that has to be the case. It has to be universal. It has to exist between agents, and it has to be respective of metaphysical common ground. And if it's not, then it is open to subjective caprice, and it will not hold up in relation to reason and rationality. So in relation to codified structures of law, what I could say is that the expression of subjectivity in order to not trespass upon another's right to medical care, like in the first place, meant that the society itself must act in a codified way to express subjectivity by preventing individuals from taking certain actions, from taking certain unnecessary risks. And that's what I would say the coronavirus restrictions are meant to do. and so they are not breaching human rights, but expressing human rights. Now, do you have an argument against that? Or and can you show that in doing so, that when they act in that way, that they are breaching human rights to a degree that is unethical?
Well, this thing I initially thought sounded Orwellian. You're talking me into it a bit more. I'm finding it fairly persuasive if you look at it, break it down into a first order and second order perspective.
Yeah.
Which
Cool.
I guess for people following along, we didn't actually talk about what that meant. So people might be thinking, yeah, but what do you mean?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I just
Would you want me to explain it, or shall you explain it? Or
you can explain it if you want. Yeah. So just for the benefit of people following along who might have not encountered that, because we didn't actually discuss that. I've just sort of like nodded.
Absolutely. So first order and second order desires are, first order desire is something that is like a preference. It's something that comes in relation to like an urge or an action urging process within a desire within the individual. It can be a whim, for example, something which is not thought about. It is not reasoned. It is just like a craving, right? You may desire chocolate crisps or something like that, or you may desire to go for a run, or it is essentially an intention with a telos, an end, and an action urging process in relation to that end. So it's a drive. It's more in its most basic sense. It could be any given natural drive that an agent experiences. A second order desire or a second order drive or principle is essentially those exact same system of drives reasoned out in relation to objective principles of, objective rational principles. And so what we do is we talk about what is common to the drives, what is attempting to be expressed in relation to those drives, what the individual is engaged in when they are trying to express those drives. And these exist as second order principles. So like these tell you which first order principle would be justifiable to engage in. Like, should I eat the cake or not? Should I go for the run or not? These are the essentially laws of like rational laws which govern our behavior and our intentionality to rise above a subjective principle to an objective one, and in doing so allow us to express subjectivity objectively. And this was first thought about by Hegel in his philosophy of right.
Right, yeah, nice one. So in a super simple way, we could say something like, I want cake, first order, but I don't want to be fat, so I don't actually want to eat the cake after all, second order. Or I'm lazy, I feel like being lazy and want to sit on the sofa and do nothing, first order. Second order, actually, all things considered, I should really go for a run because it's good for me and I want to lose weight or something like that. Despite the first order. So you can trump your first order desires with second order desires using rational, getting there in a rational way.
Yeah.
But if you lack rationality, then you're doomed to only follow your first order desires. And many people say that animals operate, non-human animals operate on first order desires.
I probably agree with that. And a philosophical way of looking at it is wanting to want. So if a first order desire is a want, then a second order desire is a want to want. It is a desire in relation to a desire.
Yeah, I would say there's some evidence to suggest that some non-human animals do actually have capacity for second order desires, but that's another conversation.
Yeah.
What I initially found it Orwellian to say that restriction is freedom, but when you say restricting first order desires to arrive at second order desires, which trump the freedom derived from the first order desires, then it makes a lot more sense, and it's no longer as Orwellian sounding at all. And I'm tending to agree there. The problem with that, though, as much as you've persuaded me on that, and I love Big Brother now, the problem with that is the fact that we would reach like a reductio on driving, because in a similar order of magnitude to the amount of annual coronavirus fatalities is the amount of traffic accident fatalities.
Yeah, but
And the first order desire to want to go somewhere unimpeded in a motor vehicle versus second order desire of societal well-being and not killing people and the freedom, the right to life, then the exact same argument as the coronavirus restrictions can be levied on driving in general, because we've had a coronavirus scale pandemic applied to just traffic accidents every year for the last decades. It's increased, obviously, with the increasing amounts of vehicles on the roads, but we're now up to about 1.35 million people each year die, and vastly more people are seriously injured and maimed and limbs chopped off and all sorts of things from driving. So you could argue that although coronavirus figures have now surpassed that 1.35 million traffic deaths, they're in the same order of magnitude.
well,
So
okay. So
I'm going to have a hard time
okay.
accepting that in one case, but not banning driving in another case.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to engage on that point. So one, I would say that the operation, like our healthcare system can absorb that amount of the accidents that we currently have in relation to driving, and does absorb that, but we can't in relation to coronavirus, which is evidenced by how many individuals need weeks of respiration after they've been infected. And so, like, obviously, when it comes to healthcare overwhelm, the healthcare service isn't actually going to be overwhelmed by driving. That's actually so. Like, in terms of placing them in relation to the risk to society, it's a false dichotomy, because you're actually risking. It's not just deaths; it's overall access to medical care. Right. So if you die in a road traffic accident, or you're engaged in a certain risky behavior, it's that you may be risking your life, but you're not risking overall public safety to the same degree that you are with coronavirus. Also, I would say in terms of driving, we do apply certain restrictions to driving. You're not allowed to text when driving. You're not allowed to be drunk when you're driving. You're not allowed to do loads of stuff when you're driving. There are certain restrictions in relation to that to make sure that you are not unnecessarily breaching something in relation to public safety. And we have codified laws and structures in place already restricting an individual's, we'll say desires and capacities when driving, in order to respect overall public mandate of the good, right, or the right. And I would go another step and say, driving and the necessity of driving is a necessary public good in relation to maintaining some of those other structures. For example, ambulance services in relation to, or deliveries in relation to oxygen deliveries and so on like that. So we'll have obviously the use of roads is pretty necessitated in terms of maintaining certain public amenities and access to healthcare and access to what we would consider rights. And obviously we would say an individual's overall subjectivity would be expressed in a greater degree if we can allow for driving. Same way as if we could allow for traveling. The issue is we can allow for driving and the risk that's involved with driving, and maintain that as an expression of subjectivity that maximizes subjectivity. We would say that our society is overall better off in relation to public safety, right? By allowing for driving, that we're actually better off in relation to access to healthcare, that we're actually okay. We can sustain this risk, but we cannot sustain the risk of breaking coronavirus restrictions. And I would say that is the difference. It would be like breaking driving rules in terms of driving without insurance. It would be or driving recklessly versus not wearing a mask and having parties and stuff. I'd say that they're more akin in terms of being comparable.
Okay. Well, I think there's something, a bit of an elephant in the room in what you've just said, in that walking is a human right, but driving a motor vehicle is not a human right, right? So when I get a driving license, I'm applying accepting, entering into a contract, right? Entering into an agreement with the state So in terms of ambulances and stuff like this, with the state, there could be, for example, certain legally permitted driving activities such as fire engines, ambulances, police cars. But then, because there's so much death from public driving, like private driving, there's only a limited amount of commercial licenses given out. And all normal people who just privately want to drive their cars, nope, you can't drive your cars anymore because too many people are dying and it's too much of a danger to society because 1.35 million people a year die, right? So although that death and all the hospitalizations from traffic accidents, which all the people who didn't die, which is vastly more people than 1.35 million a year, although the hospital can deal with all of those hospitalizations and the morgue can deal with all those dead bodies from driving, they're still injuries, they're still quadriplegics, they're still dead bodies at the end of the day. It's still harming society. So in the case of coronavirus, whether or not we have a lockdown, the shit's hit the fan a bit and people are going to die. If we have a lockdown, people are going to die. If we don't have a lockdown, people are going to die.
Less people are going to die though. And it's not just less people are going to die. It's like less people are going to be hospitalized and not receive ventilation. So it's like if we want people to receive ventilation, then we are going to have to restrict society's freedoms to slow down the spread, not prevent it. Because as you say, it's probably going to spread anyway. But it's just to make sure that our healthcare service can absorb those individuals who it's spreading to so that they can be ventilated and have a good chance at recovery. It's whether we are going to accept a certain level of risk in relation to subjectivity of our society. And I'd say that society would deem, the risk of driving in relation to road traffic accidents as being a lower risk than coronavirus and public health overwhelm. I mean, like hell, like if we didn't look at it like this. If we become overwhelmed in relation to coronavirus, right, and like 500 beds, like 420 beds out of a 500 and something bed hospital had coronavirus patients on, and because of the way the pandemic works, if we need to isolate entire wards, because if it's got one coronavirus person on, so like as soon as like you breach one ward and you have to open another, take another ward for coronavirus, well, all of those beds are now corona beds, regardless of whether that actually, go all filled or not, right? So the entire hospitals are pretty much being, like entire floors are being just turned into coronavirus floors, right? Now, let's say you have a road traffic accident, and you need surgery, and to recover out of surgery, you're going to require like ICU, except ICU is now full of coronavirus patients, and so you can't access what would be necessary to maintain your ability to drive a car. So like even like or let's say it's like to perform any other potentially dangerous action in society, like you walk down the street, you slip on some ice and you break your hip, well, that's too bad that you need medical treatment, because if you go to the hospital you're not going to be able to receive it. That's the kind of outcome that could happen because of coronavirus, that like there are so many actions in relation to public health and safety, that public safety, that we mitigate the effects of by having a healthcare service that is capable of absorbing a certain amount of risk, that as soon as we engage in a high risk activity, which basically coronavirus has turned socializing into a high risk activity, then we would cripple our healthcare service and would be incapable of absorbing those other risks. So what we have to do is essentially mitigate risk and deem certain risks as unacceptable in order to maintain the greatest level of subjectivity, of expression of subjectivity within our society. And I would say that, like, look, telling people that they can't socialize for a few months until we've got the vaccine rolled out, it's not that big of a deal in terms of respecting subjectivity as a whole. It's like, look, restricting someone's subjectivity so that they aren't able to travel for a year, in relation to preventing people dying or preventing people from accessing medication or medicine and so on, like that, is it's I would say a justifiable restriction upon an individual, that this restriction is expressing freedom to the greatest degree. Now, do you reject that these restrictions express freedom to the greatest degree in principle?
I sort of do. Yeah, I do reject it, because what you've got to weigh up is, you've ultimately, using this conception of expressing freedom to the greatest degree, you've entered into a perilous utilitarian domain, because anything that is done to the greatest degree is inherently utilitarian and evil.
No,
So
that is definitely not how that works.
that's basically,
Consequentialist, maybe.
or like let's take the Bentham's like initial conceptualization of utilitarianism, the greatest what was it, the greatest degree of happiness for all in society. I can't remember the exact wording,
Mhm.
But when you have anything to the greatest degree, you're starting to have to do utilitarian calculus and stuff. So we're going to have to say, what about all the people who committed suicide from social isolation? What about the social isolation of everyone who, like, what about entire boarding schools that have been locked down, and
Oh,
you've got
but what
international
do you think? What do you?
students just sitting there miserable? What
Well,
about all the misery from lockdown? Like, you've got to weigh that up in your calculation now.
Yeah,
Are we better
absolutely.
off?
In terms of like subjectivity, I would say that like what it is in a Hegelian understanding of right and duty. Duty is reflective of a consequence, and that is the expression of subjectivity. The reason that we have rules and regulations in terms of like behavioral codes, in terms of ethics in the first place, is to allow us to express our desires in the greatest degree possible. It is in achieve our interests in the greatest degree possible, like achieve that which is genuinely beneficial for us, and that is the point. Unless you're going to argue for like a Kantian, like abstract right, which I don't know if you're going to do, I would say then pretty much every deontological framework is going to be in respect to something, and I would say that the most rational position would be subjectivity and the expression of subjectivity.
Well, my ethics are essentially Kantian, so like that is
Okay.
something that I would do.
Okay.
But
So
but
how?
we don't have to even go there, because I think we don't need to get into the meta ethics. I still think there's like the practical things that we can talk about before we have to take a deep dive in meta ethics. And I think maybe that could even be for another conversation, because we've been talking for a while now anyway. But one of the things that I want to bring up is the fact that the furlough scheme has been so vastly expensive on the taxpayer. So much money being printed for the furlough scheme. How much do you think it costs to build a Nightingale hospital? You got to build a Nightingale hospital, then every city, and had change to finish the NS2 railway or whatever it's called. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it was so expensive, the furlough scheme, and it's still ongoing. It's so expensive. You could have put a Nightingale hospital in every living room, basically. A bit of an exaggeration, but the amount of money being spent is colossal. And so it just seems like we're prepared to spend vast amounts of money to get everyone to stay at home and not work and shatter the economy, in order to thwart coronavirus. But we're not prepared to build hospitals to deal with the capacity of the inevitable,
Well,
which would be
I mean,
far cheaper.
I think it would have been made. I think it would probably made more sense just to have a much more stringent lockdown straight away, restrict people's freedom to a greater degree for overall long term benefit. But our government are a bit of pussies. So, like, if you look at China, for example, it worked better when China restricted the freedom of its population to a greater degree, and then it didn't have to worry about lockdowns and that so much more. And they did build hospitals, as you say, like incredibly quickly, in order to come into contact with that. I'm not saying that the government's dealt with this right. I mean, absolutely not. I'm not justifying anything that Boris Johnson's done. My God, like, please don't ever make me have to fight that position. What I'm saying is that the coronavirus restrictions are in principle right. I'm not saying that the ones that we've put in operation have been good. I would have been way more stringent, like in a much faster way. Probably had it be go on for little bit longer, and then I wouldn't probably. I don't think that. I think that would have been more effective. I certainly wouldn't have. I certainly wouldn't have. I certainly wouldn't have done anything the way that this government's done. I mean, the way this government's full of a bunch of fucking idiots. Like, if I'm honest, I don't think they know their arse from their elbow. If I'm to put it professionally.
Yeah, well, I think there's been some blunders. I'm more of a conservative than you. Like I'm slightly like centre,
Yeah, I'm a
a hair
socialist.
right,
Yeah,
and you're further left.
further left. One can say that. Yeah, further left.
So we're obviously going to have political disagreements, but let's not get tangled up in too much politics here. I think what it comes down to, I think the crux of the debate as it stands really is we're agreeing that human rights are violated for the restrictions, but you're not agreeing that it's therefore unethical to violate human rights, to violate human rights because of this first and second order conceptualization of the maximization of the will.
You see, well, I would say that I would not use the words violate, because I think violate would say that it would fail to comply with human rights, and I disagree with that. I think that these restrictions are not only complying with human rights, but are necessary to facilitate the expression of human rights. So I'm rejecting P2.
Okay.
But I think we both agree that obviously it is a restriction. Like, we both agree it's a restriction.
Right, but what you've done by rejecting P2 is take issue with the word violate, and you've just substituted it with a synonym.
What? Restrict?
Yeah, like
How is that a synonym?
Oh, it's not violating. It's failing to comply with.
No. It's restricting an individual's freedom in relation to like restrict is to like limit someone's freedoms. It's not to violate, which would be to disregard. So what we are saying is that the greatest overall expression of human rights required the limitation of human rights for a certain period of time. That doesn't say violate. That would be a very different you can't you can't say that they were synonymous. That's not true.
Okay. What I want to get in before we start wrapping it up and really getting into
Like closing statements and stuff.
Yeah, closing, or potentially, if you want to push for concession, or if I want to push for a concession or anything like that, I don't think you're interested in that. You're more interested in the conversation.
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's been interesting, and I think we've been putting across opposing points of view that some people might have not considered, and I think it's been an interesting conversation, and it's not been point scoring, it's just been discussing the both sides, which has been very interesting. I think the last thing that I want to put to you to see your take on this is I don't know if this is a conspiracy theory insofar as
that's a good start. That's a good.
Like, I'm not wedded to the idea that this isn't somehow a conspiracy theory in the way that I'm going to put it, but it's pretty much convincing in the medical literature now that ivermectin, which is a parasitic worm medication, which has been used since the 70s or something, very safe, very old, very cheap medication, is very compellingly demonstrated in the medical literature now from various reputable, authoritative organizations and peer-reviewed literature that ivermectin is highly effective at every stage of coronavirus infection, from prophylactic, so preventing coronavirus, getting it in the first place, to preventing the progression of disease, to making, even in ICU beds, making recovery more likely. And now there's uncontroversial, peer-reviewed, published, high-quality medical literature on ivermectin saying that.
I have no idea to comment on any of that. It would be great if it is. I mean, like, hell, that'd be fucking class. Like, I have no idea though. So I can't really comment on that. You'd have to talk to someone like I don't know, a doctor or something, someone that has a lot more medical knowledge and has done research on this sort of stuff to get any real conclusive position on that. I mean, I would definitely do some research on it. Um, I'd be interested in hearing doctors talk about it. So if there's any like medical professionals that are listening in, yeah, definitely hit us up with that and we can talk about it. And obviously, if you
Right.
can
Well,
if you can present that as being the case, then I would certainly say that we should be definitely pushing people to be, you know, like taking that medication or being given that medication if they're not already, and so on, making it widely known.
right. So the conspiracy theory thing comes in now. So that wasn't the conspiracy theory. The conspiracy theory now is the reason why, as you're saying, like obviously, great miracle drug, effectively, in quotes, miracle drug. Let's flood the world with ivermectin and get rid of this pandemic once and for all, or at least treat the people in hospitals when they're severely ill, because it has. It's not a miracle, but it's something like 20% improvement or something. I can't remember the exact.
Still, that's pretty considerable, yeah.
Yeah, it's considerable. It would basically end any overwhelmed hospitals like quickly, because it's considerable enough to really make an impact. But so the conspiracy theory bit now is the fact that with all the government has known about this, there's been government advisors, especially in America. The information I'm getting is from America on this, that the FDA have known about this and have been presented the peer-reviewed medical literature on this months and months ago, like last year, summer last year, and it hasn't passed approval to be used in treatment outside of experimental clinical trials. So there is a slight conspiracy theory angle that there is some motivation or reason for ivermectin being so ignored or overlooked. If it was just being clumsily overlooked, or it would be so spectacularly dumb. It would be just spectacularly dumb for like all of the governments in the world to overlook this as a viable treatment,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
like hell,
So
like I can't look. I'm not gonna lie to you. I have no idea, so I'm not gonna be able to tell you like, oh yeah, like absolutely, you know, like the governments are evil and then conspiring against the population. Don't get me wrong, wouldn't be surprised. Hate the government, libertarian socialist over here. So you know, I'm not really gonna say that the governments are, you know, ultimately a good thing. Especially the way that they're run. And I'm not saying that they don't have vested interests, because I know they do. I think the Iraq War was an unjustified war. Yeah, we went into that. I said everything but war there. And essentially, like, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't be surprised if, like, look, with the way that we're treating coronavirus, like, even if it is a problem, we are probably doing it in a way that benefits certain vested interests in a greater overall way than it otherwise would. Like, so for example, the restrictions are great for certain businesses. Thank you very much. Certain businesses, the, like, you know, Amazon and so on. It's also depleting, like, it's destroying small businesses. It's a good cover up for an economic recession, like the ones that we have every 5 to 7 years, especially the ones that are getting worse because we're not dealing with, like, you know, debt that's building up in society. We're not actually fixing that. And this also just happens to be very similar to the debt jubilee in terms of the furlough scheme, which would be necessary to clear off public debts in relation to what we've been saying would necessarily be mandated to prevent recession for the last, I don't know, 20 years nearly. So, like, in terms of being basically following Friedman economics, which he basically said, look, if we're going to follow this economic format, we're going to have to give everyone money. It just seems to be very similar to that. And, you know, the United States hates giving people money, yet has all of a sudden gave people $2,000 pretty much each. 1,600, I think, but then, you know, like, basically said they've got 400 already or whatever. But, like, essentially, it's very much like the debt jubilee that's, like, written into Friedman economics. I'm not saying that I don't see the similarities and the vested interests in all of this, because of course there always is. This is capitalism, man. Like, if there's a quick buck to be made, it's going to be made. It's like, why is, like, in terms of, like, you know, like the way that the vaccine has been run has been, like, appallingly capitalist. The ways in which other countries are going to be able to access the vaccine, even though that, like, it's a public health crisis in other countries. Like, we're allowing Brazil to suffer, like, an incredible infrastructural issues without global aid, even though if it does that, if it does suffer that way, it'll lead to a mutation of the virus, which will ultimately, be transmitted back to us. Yet we don't intervene. Like the whole way in everything in which we've dealt with this crisis has been absolutely either a shambles in relation to capitalism, or it's been, in relation to vested interests. Now, I don't think any of that's a conspiracy theory right there. I don't think anything what I've said there's a conspiracy theory. Whether or not like we're hiding drugs and shit like that, okay, that's a bit conspiracy theory. That doesn't make it wrong. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying that makes it wrong, because like, sometimes conspiracy theories come out to be true. You know what I mean? It's just I can't say whether it's right or wrong or not.
Well, you've covered a bunch of things that I was a bit tentative to actually discuss there, like the economic things and the I would actually add to that list potential lobby interests of vaccine and big pharma.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, look, big pharma's worth more than every other tertiary business combined. So like, quadrillary business combined. Like in terms of like the top 10 biggest companies in the US in terms of in that I can't remember how the thingy them out, but in terms of like research and development and such. Like if you like essentially big pharma is worth every single one of those companies underneath put together. I mean, like look, like 150 billion on statin drugs alone, and we do not tell people to avoid cholesterol and saturated fat, really. Right. Like, in terms of like animal products and stuff. Like
we know through like plant-based nutrition and treating all of the chronic diseases, like the top 10 causes of death. Most vegans know how powerful the lobby interests are in 100%. Big pharma.
And I wouldn't not rule that out. And I would not even rule out like, the way that I'm not saying that coronavirus, like this is why I love that you put in principle, because if you hadn't put in principle, I would have been very tentative of going into the debate, because it would have been about empiricism. There could have been stuff that I didn't know. And I just don't have all the information like necessary to make the claims that they were right to implement all of these restrictions in the first place. But what I can say is that in principle, these restrictions are justified. Do you see what I mean? But like, if you were to say empirically, are they justified is a different question.
Yeah, but the thing that I'm seeing is coronavirus restrictions are contingent on the empirical. The empirical stuff is brought in by tacit through. So yeah, in principle, what I'm saying is in principle, we can talk about ethical principles, right? And we can talk about is a human right violated? Is a human right not violated? We could talk about first and second order desires and stuff like this.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we need to talk about that in the context of what the coronavirus restriction actually is in the first place. Because the coronavirus restriction is you can't travel because you'll infect someone. But if it's empirically false that that's the case, then we can't argue that first and second order desire thing, because the first order desire is being violated, or if you like, not complied with. But the second order desire, it is a fraud, right? So then there's no overriding second order desire. So it is contingent on empirical.
Yeah, but I think like obviously I would like to hope that when we're going into this debate, like when we're talking about the coronavirus like restrictions that have been put in, I think we're basically saying like, look, coronavirus exists. That it is as infectious as we've been led to believe, and without these restrictions, because you even said, look, people would be wrong for not following the guideline, which implies that you would agree that there would be
people would be asocial. People would be antisocial by coughing at each other or having parties. That would be a bit antisocial in a pandemic.
But it's like basically you're saying that the risk exists. You're just denying whether we can or cannot restrict an individual's freedom. Now, like in terms of like place restrictions upon an individual overall to express freedom is what I would argue. So I would say that we are justified. But then
I was just going to say, if the reason why I brought up ivermectin, this drug, which is extremely beneficial in treating COVID, is if ivermectin is known to be effective, but the government favors restricting people's freedoms rather than rolling out a cheap, accessible, safe drug. Sorry?
Then I would say it was wrong to restrict their freedom.
Right. There you go. So that is a pivot point in the debate. If we accept the the conspiracy theory angle for ivermectin, then you would concede to the proposition. But if we granted that was a conspiracy theory and wasn't true, then I'm starting to think that you've got quite a persuasive argument with your Hegelian stuff.
Cool. I mean, that's fair enough. I mean, it's like, but it's like, at what point do we say that, like, I think that we're both, I don't know, like, I thought that I guess we could have outlined this a bit better, because, like, I thought when we went into this that we both accept that coronavirus is a genuine risk. The general population, I would even say, must believe it to a certain degree. Otherwise, like, the only way that they can access information is in relation to the public health authorities that are telling them that it is a risk, and so they'll be relying upon their own research and their own ability to understand that research. And if anything, if I learn from the vegan gains destiny debate, then no one should ever argue for that. I don't know if you saw the debate. I'm just making a reference to, like, obviously vegan gains talking about, like, stats, and obviously, like, I would say that the average layman should fall on the side of authority. Like, not because of just because I think that's the rational thing to do in relation to accepting one's own limitations, and so that's what I would do.
I just thought it was bizarre, because the fact that, like, if he looked at the data and it was compelling, and the study said, yeah, we're not really sure, but it does look like maybe there is some benefit or something like that. That's one thing. But the study literally said, nope, not statistically significant. And the data, the way that he was getting to his conclusion from the data was so rigid and theoretical. It was just like, come on, like, that wasn't. I thought that was a vegan gains fail moment, and he's normally quite good with his studies.
I would agree. I would agree. It wasn't his finest hour, unfortunately. But this is the kind of thing that I would think that we would avoid. Usually, when we take, the expertise of those individuals who exist in our institutions, and I think that's the same thing with that we'll have to do unless we are of a similar expertise, unless we're in the institution. You know what I mean? Or capable of giving, like, a grounded formal critique from an external position, like, the institution itself is incapable of acknowledging this evidence, but this evidence exists and we can present it and we can have that discussion. But I think the general population will be justified in believing that coronavirus does exist. I think the general population will be justified in believing that the restrictions are necessary to respect public health and safety. And I think so the restrictions are rational and justified in relation to the information that is widely available to the population as of yet. If it does turn out that you're right, and in terms of I can't say the drug's name. Ivermectin, thanks. Then yeah, I think things change, just as much as things could change if it turns out that it wasn't as virulent, or I don't know, it was a global conspiracy from the start. I don't know, depending on obviously what happens. Like, obviously everything changes, obviously depending upon new and different information that may come to light. But as of right now, I would say that the restrictions are justified, necessary, and respect human rights to a greater overall possible degree.
Right, yeah. I would agree that coronavirus does exist. There are some people who think that it doesn't exist, but I wouldn't say that's ridiculous. A coronavirus does exist. It is deadly. It is contagious. The general guidelines from the medical industry are sensible. Wearing a mask is sensible. Staying 2 meters apart is sensible. Not having parties is sensible. These things are advisory, and people should be social and adhere to these things. I don't think it's a big Illuminati orchestration, but I do think that there is some weirdness around ivermectin. And if ivermectin is being not rolled out in favor of locking down and imposing restrictions and taking away personal freedoms and human rights from people because of some either big pharma lobbyist interests or economic interests, like helicopter money, like you were saying, all of these things that we were discussing earlier. If ivermectin is being subtly ignored,
was that a Kaiser report reference there? Did I hear the helicopter money? Like, because they use that expression all the time. Like,
well, I'm not the biggest fan of what's his face,
Max Kaiser.
Yeah, Max Kaiser. I'm not as big as I am
I'm not that
also a
biggest
big fan
fan
of
either,
Paul,
but that was actually a really good, informative episode, I think, when they were talking about if we're referencing the same one, which is actually where he talks about helicopter money and bailing out banks, and why do we always bail out banks rather than bailing out the debtors in a system in which the debt fell on the side of um, of the general population. So why didn't we pay the mortgages off rather than and give it to the people who needed to pay their mortgages so that the debt would be cleared? Why did we give it to the banks who arguably didn't even own the debt anymore and were the cause of the problem in the first place? And so they've caused an economic crash, and we've gave them money because they've caused an economic crash when we could have gave it to the general population and mandated be to be paid to the banks and so on, and like to pay off debts in order to make sure that GDP kept moving and shit like that. But it is. Like, I think you raised a really good point in that episode. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that sometimes Max. I think, and as well, Russian fucking RT is like the biggest like bias like news network ever, especially when they talk about Vladimir
yeah,
Putin, who just seems to come across as some sort of fucking god. But like,
yeah,
but
yeah.
you
No,
know,
I agree, man.
they do sometimes make some decent
RT is,
points.
RT is a pretty propaganda arm of Russia.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. Unfortunately, yeah.
yeah, but some of the stuff there is quite fun. But yeah, I tune in occasionally. Max Kaiser is definitely an interesting guy. He's a fellow Bitcoin bull, but yeah, I don't agree with everything. He's a bit conspiratorial and a bit sort of extreme sometimes.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Say, I would agree
he
there.
does make some interesting points. The last thing, so that's the jigsaw puzzle so far. The last thing I would say is, we talked a few times about the reductio of driving, with all the people dying there. You made some good points in response to that. I feel like we haven't. I haven't really satisfactorily like sort of had that reductio taken off the table for me. I feel like you've addressed bits of it, but I still feel like really, if we wanted to prevent 1.35 million people in society each year dying, we could ban driving, and we could do a lot more. We can do a lot more things. We could ban coal factories from killing all the people in China. There's so many things that we could ban to prevent vast amounts of people dying, but we don't because um, yeah, that is something we just don't do. So it seems that with coronavirus restrictions, the governments were very quick to shit on our personal liberty, but they're very slow to restrict big pharma or restrict
Can't disagree with the whole
Coca-Cola or
with restricting corporations is like the last thing they ever do. I don't get me wrong. I don't disagree there. So are
uh,
you wanting to make like closing statements or like
yeah,
shall we just yeah?
I would say that sort of constitutes where we're at in terms of my perception of the debate. I think you've made some really great points. I think I've put forward some points of conversation which we can think about. I think we've put opposing. We've discussed the views back and forwards. I don't think there's been any point scoring or any sort of winning or anything like that. I think both sides have. There's some very interesting points to discuss, and I think it's still an ongoing open question in terms of it. I'm not 100% convinced either way, but you have put some really interesting points with the first and second ordered freedom on the table, which I'm going to go away and think about more. But I think if you're if the ivermectin thing turns out to be um, not a conspiracy, and it really would overwhelm the hospitals, and all of the data indicates that and everything. I'm going to have to go away and think about that. Maybe you've got a point there, but as it is, I'm not really sure either way. I feel like this is a bit of an open one. I'm normally with these debates I do on Ethereum, I'm normally pushing for concession and have a really strong angle. But in this one, I think you've really sort of opened my mind to a new perception of it. But I'm not really convinced. I'm unsure what position I actually take now. But I don't know. I guess that's my closing statement.
Yeah. Well, thank you for Soldier for the debate, and thank you everyone in Arthuria for the debate, and thank you for the audience for watching. Um, So, in terms of my closing statement, I would say that the restrictions in relation to COVID-19 are actually an expression of human rights and not a violation of them. That the premise, too, that you've postulated in the brief syllogism that you gave, which I don't think is the entirety of your argument, although maybe the crux of your argument, was that the individual who, the restrictions of an individual's liberties, we'll call them, postulate a restriction of or an unethical act, and so are unethical in general. Like if we restrict someone's freedom, the freedom of speech, the freedom of movement, we are ultimately restricting, we are acting unethically. And so what I've tried to do here is show in relation to first order and second order desires that not all restrictions are unethical, that we can have rational restrictions which actually express subjectivity to a greater overall possible degree, and it's not a violation of human rights, it's actually a support of human rights, and so it's the rule of double effect. These restrictions in relation to COVID are overall respecting an individual's right to access adequate medical care, to access, to live in a free and safe society. And so without these restrictions, we would ultimately be unjustified. Obviously, it's you arguing that, it could be the case that these restrictions are unnecessary if, certain drugs are effective and haven't been accessed in a market, or, lobbyist groups have had too much power in relation to these restrictions. I would say that would be justified. Although right now, as a member of the general population and a layperson, in regards to the economic interests of those corporations and obviously of the medical literature, I can't speak about those things. And so I would say that it would be rational to support the restrictions in relation to what the government has said. The R rate is, the fatality rate is, and overall the capacity of our healthcare system to sustain itself in relation to the uncontrolled spread of the virus. It was estimated that over 50,000 people could become infected on a day-to-day basis very rapidly if it was uncontrolled. And we did reach a point in which over 44,000 people were infected in a single day. And so what we can see is that if there isn't, a global monolithic conspiracy, that these restrictions are necessary to prevent public health overwhelm, and therefore are actually facilitating the expression of human rights and access to necessary medical care. Obviously, I think that we do need to debate these things, and I do appreciate you bringing this up, because we cannot allow for a restriction of liberties, especially in relation to the right to education, the right to free movement, and the right of public gatherings, which are even important to for right to protest and so on, without having a genuine ethical stance in relation to what would be a justifiable reason to take these measures. So although I do side with the affirmative that we should have these restrictions and that these restrictions are justified, and that they're not unethical in principle, I would say that I do appreciate the conversation and the opposition in this regard. So thank you very much.
That's one, man. Really good conversation.
Yeah, thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, nice debate, guys. Thank you guys, as always. I really appreciate it. And we actually have one question from the Discord audience, and it's directed at both of you, if that sounds good to both of you.
Go ahead.
Okay, awesome. So the user is actually no longer in the VC, but it was from the user Walt, and they ask, is violating a mask mandate a violation of the non-aggression principle?
Violating a mask what?
The mask mandate.
A mask mandate. Yeah, you got it.
Mask mandate. Oh, what, like the coronavirus restrictions?
Yeah.
Okay. Violation of the non-aggression principle. That's an interesting question. The non-aggression principle is a principle that some people... it is a very libertarian thing to talk about non-aggression principle.
It is. Yeah.
But the thing is, the non-aggression principle isn't actually something that is rigidly part of the legal system, and it's not necessarily something which is used as a core principle in many ethical, like moral systems in philosophy, as far as I'm aware. Like it's used a bit, but it's not like. Would you agree? Perspective.
Yeah, I think it is incredibly libertarian in its origin. It's not necessarily something. It's not like a dictative principle in terms of our governance, and I don't think it's necessarily accepted by every moral stance. Since it basically says that any aggression is inherently illegitimate, when that's not necessarily the case. Obviously, we could, even under the rule of double effect, say that aggression can be legitimate if it's to protect one's own subjectivity, and that sometimes like someone's passivity can still threaten one's own subjectivity. Like, would an individual be justified in acting aggressively if it was ordered to prevent a greater overall harm that could possibly happen? These are things that we need to talk about. Obviously, it's basically about whether individuals are justified in taking aggressive action upon themselves, and I'd say most of the time that they're not. And I would say that in terms of whether it would break the non-aggression principle or not, whether we accept the non-aggression principle, I would probably say that there is a solid argument there to say that it would break the non-aggression principle if we accept that an individual's presence could be a use of force, like the same way that a police officer's presence could be a use of force, if there is a risk being caused by their presence. So, like, when a police officer arrives, the government consider that a use of force, especially in the United States. It's actually in use of force law that is the first action of force. It's an aggressive move, and that is essentially in relation to the risk that the officer arrives with. Putting an officer on scene can escalate the situation as well as de-escalate the situation, and it's a use of force to basically attempt to de-escalate the situation. Like, the law has arrived, like enforcement has now arrived. The action can now be taken legitimately by another individual. And in the same sense that an individual could be breaking the non-aggression principle by having coronavirus or potentially having coronavirus in a situation. If you are breaching another individual's 2 meter space, then you could be placing them at undue risk. And so acting aggressively in terms of placing them in an increased risk. And so you maybe, I would say that would be a solid position to hold. I'd probably say that I don't want to say it definitely would be. I don't necessarily know all the literature behind the non-aggression principle. But I would say that I think I could make the argument that it would break the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, I would say, if I actually have to answer the original question rather than just like talking about the non-aggression principle itself, I'd say it depends, because if you break the travel ban, for example, to go somewhere and you wear a mask and you stay 10 meters away from everyone and you're walking in the forest or something, like that's not really going to be breaking a non-aggression principle, I don't think. But if you break the restrictions to not wear a mask and cough on people's heads in the supermarket, then you're definitely breaking it there.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And would you guys be open to me asking my audience as well if they have any questions? Or
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
Totally
No,
unacceptable.
go ahead.
Okay. If you did you say you're cool with it as well, Stone Shepherd?
Oh yeah, I'm just playing around, man. It's totally cool.
All right, cool. So if anyone in the audience would like to ask me or Foot Soldier a question in relation to this debate, then please drop a question in the chat, and we will do our best to answer them. At me or Foot Soldier, in order to get it seen. So yeah, please do that if you have any questions in the next few minutes. So yeah, and I do appreciate, obviously, is hosting the debate, Stone Shepherd and obviously everyone else from Arthuria. I think it's been really nice. I do like these debates on Arthuria, and I think you're right, Foot Soldier, in saying that this is probably one of the best places to have a civil discussion with online. There are so many truly cancerous debate servers.
Yeah. I joined a new one recently, and the guy was like, there was about 20 people in the room, and it was a religion debate, and I was just talking about modal logic. I was explaining this to Stone yesterday, and I was just talking about modal logic, about I can't even remember the argument. It was just really civilly talking about this in respect to like a Pascal's wager type argument, and the guy, because I started talking about modal logic, the guy got so irate for some reason I don't even understand. he threatened to beat me up like, on Discord. Like, how do you even know where I live? But he's like, oh, I'm
I
gonna
will
beat you up.
find you.
He was getting
Brad,
so
like
irate.
Taken or something. Like, I will find you and I will kill you.
Yeah, and it's like, what kind of toxic bullshit is that? We're just having a discussion, like in a philosophy server. What you want about? You're gonna beat me up, and like, and people just started shouting and screaming and call me a retard and call me this and so, it can be so toxic on Discord. But Arthuria is one place that you don't get that because, like, here it's just a crowd of cool, educated people who like to discuss like decent stuff, and you can put your like your prop in with the request command, and then someone can accept your prop, and then you can debate it. It's set up really nicely here. Whereas, like, yeah, like so many other servers are just like the really busy ones are the most toxic ones, right? There's a few nice, like small, like super geeky philosophy discourse, but I find that this is the nicest balance of a general atmosphere of educated people, but not too geeky. Still,
not
like,
not
sort of,
too geeky.
it's a
I like
nice
that.
balance.
Well, I think we've got a question from Tomato as well.
Yeah, go.
So yeah, in terms of freedom of the, so this is Tomato. I'm a terrible. Actually, does anyone else want to read? Because I'm actually the worst reader in the world. Like genuinely.
Oh, I have a question to both. In terms of freedom of first and second order desires, where do you stand on euthanasia? Should it be illegal or is it a first order freedom? If it is a freedom, how do you draw the line of when someone meets the threshold of their potential personal harm to euthanize versus not to? If doctors are the ones to determine on a case by case basis, could that be a potential pattern of power moving more and more into specialists than laymen can't challenge? Also, what about the flip side? Should it be illegal to never exercise and only eat jelly sweets? Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think euthanasia. I'm against euthanasia. I think that suicide is immoral, and I reach that through a Kantian perspective. And eating sweets and never exercising, I also think is immoral. And again, I reach that through like a neo-Kantian lens.
Okay, I would say that euthanasia can be justified. I think that having specialists involved is very important, but respecting that an individual must have the volition necessary to participate in euthanasia is also very important. If it's about the expression of subjectivity, then I would say that it would be the individual rationally expressing their subjectivity to meet their interests, and their interest is to avoid unnecessary suffering, as it is to express, their desires in relation to pleasure and pain, or like positives rather. So, what I would say is that euthanasia can be justified, that it would be gauged against the narrative of an individual's life, as in, like, would their life be considered better, having greater experiential value if they died sooner? And in which case, do they agree with that? Are they using right reason to come to that conclusion? And has this been verified by individuals separate from them in relation to, let's say, the medical practice from which they would have to derive the medical information from in relation to their pain, and also from, let's say, individuals who could justify whether they were rationalizing properly, like psychologists or psychiatrists, and also in relation to, like, I would say, a use of a philosopher would be nice for once, and understanding whether the individuals are actually engaged in rational discourse, if they are actually arguing properly, and those are the things that I would argue would be necessary to show that an individual was justified in ending their life prematurely or before via artificial means. But if it could be shown that it was the case, that it would be actually better off, and it would free them from experiencing unnecessary suffering, and so the value of their life would be greater than if they were allowed to experience that suffering, then yeah, I would say that that was actually respecting their subjectivity.
Yeah, interesting perspective.
I was going to say, like, in relation to the jelly sweets thing, the difference is that an individual who eats jelly sweets is also acting in relation to volition. I think that the funny thing is that you are right in saying that both could, like, you could be irrational for eating jelly sweets. And I'd say that we should condemn an individual for eating jelly sweets, like only jelly sweets and not exercising. But ultimately, we would probably have to intervene in an individual's bodily autonomy to force them to act otherwise, and not cause, not take those actions upon themselves. I think that if we could show that it was like an expression of an irrational, disordered eating pattern, and that they were putting themselves at undue risk, that we would be justified in intervening. Yes, I would say that we would be justified in intervening. In the case that we should intervene in people like, Eugenia Cooney, I think that she should be like, someone should intervene in relation to her anorexia. In relation to, people with bigorexia who are, pumping their arms full of what the hell's that shit called? That horrible salty stuff that basically that can shut your heart down. I can't remember what it's called. There's a word. I can't remember what it's called. It's totally gone. But it can make you lose your arms and stuff. Absolutely nasty stuff. Same with orthorexia, if you compulsively exercising and it's causing you harm. Things like that. Like, if an individual's rationality has been compromised and they are taking unnecessary risks with themselves or placing themselves into harm, then yes, we should intervene as a society. But, I will say that it does require certain levels of trust in our institutions, which have not been shown to be the case, primarily because of the vested power interests overall in society and the way that we've, created society as a whole. So I think that there is a political aspect to this and an ethical aspect to this. So yeah.
Nice. Looks like you got another question in your chat perspective.
Yeah, if we take the view that taking risks of going outside without a mask is a violation of the right to life, would we have to say that their violation is on par with an assailant? You mean like as in like they are like I guess it depends on what you mean by assailant, doesn't it? I wouldn't say that it was on par with an assailant, because I think if you're actively, intentionally trying to harm someone, that would be separate. I think that there is a big difference there. Like, there is a big difference in sense of intention, and I think that there is a big difference in sense of likelihood to cause damage, and the levels of damage that you could cause are directly in relation to that intention, rather than maybe unintentional spreading of a virus, which is which basically is not changed in relation to your behavior beyond how much viral load you give to an individual. Like, you don't give them asthma or something. So yeah, I'd say that intention plays a massive role, and so I wouldn't say that they were that their violation is on par with an assailant, primarily because of intention. And obviously direct impedance of the subjectivity rather than accidental. So yes, Foot Soldier, would you like to?
Hold on. I've lost the original question. Hold on, I'll just reread that. I don't essentially understand the question.
So like, well, if I'm understanding it correctly, he's saying that would be like going and wearing a mask not wearing a mask in a public space be equivalent to assaulting another individual in relation to risk. So like, if you are taking a risk with another individual, in both cases, are they on par? And I'm saying that they're not on par. What do you think?
Well, the thing is that I think the problem is when you go out in the street, you might not have you statistically speaking, you don't have coronavirus more likely than not. Then, if you do have coronavirus, which is quite a small chance, you then have some smaller chance of giving it to someone else. It's not 100% that you'll give it to someone, so there's a small chance there. And then, if someone does get it, there's a very small chance, around 1%, that they'll get seriously ill or die from it. So at every chain there's a smaller and smaller percent that we end up with me going out of my house without a mask is actually, it means that it's probably like a 0.000 something percent of actually killing someone, right? And me going out in my car, there's also a 0.00 something chance of killing someone. I think the chance of killing someone with coronavirus is probably higher right now than with a car, but I don't exactly know what those figures are. But if we are considering it assault by just going out the house without a mask, regardless of whether you've got symptoms or not, like you're asymptomatic, you're just leaving your house and going for a walk without a mask or something like this. If we're considering that assault, then driving a car would seem to be assault too, unless you're prepared to set a threshold at which it is no longer assault. But I guess we're having to set some sort of threshold of what is and what isn't assault anyway. But the threshold that I'm using, both of the cases would fall below that threshold. Whereas, I don't know, perspective might diverge there slightly. But
well, I think
I don't know.
I think that like obviously I pivot this mostly on intention for one. I think that like I think intention's a big thing, and I think obviously risk is a big definitely in relation. Like look, like it you can say that someone was unjustified in taking a certain level of risk as if they should have known better than to take that risk, and then that's reckless endangerment. But even in terms of reckless endangerment versus assault, we categorize them as two separate crimes. So I think that even if the risk was high enough to say that, look, you should have known better, you've endangered public safety, which I would say that it was, it still doesn't, it still wouldn't fall in the categorization of assault, because that implies a level of intention in relation to deliberately putting an individual at harm. I think if you spat on someone, like, so for example, there was someone who got spat on the London Underground. It seemed to me even be an act of like racism, where a black ticket inspector was spat on by someone who said that they had COVID-19, and then that ticket inspector later died of COVID-19. I would consider that assault and then murder. Primarily because they've took the aggressive act of trying to deliberately infect another individual with COVID. If you accidentally infect someone with COVID, I would say that would be different. If you've disrespected the rules and infected them accidentally, it's different to spitting on someone and deliberately infecting them. And I think if we can, for us to be able to make that distinction in the first place, we have to be able to make the distinction in the intention of the agent.
Yeah, I agree 100% there, because that's what I opened with in my opening statement with the mens rea and the actus reus component. So the actus reus is the contracting coronavirus from someone, but the mens rea is I'm going to spit in your face because, I don't know, racist reasons or whatever reason. And so both components are present, and so that is then criminal, and then that it should be murder or manslaughter. I don't know what it should be, but it should be punishable by something quite hefty. I 100% agree with that. But if you're just walking about not wearing a mask in the forest, that shouldn't be a problem. But here, I don't know what is happening in the UK, but right now in Italy, if you are in the forest walking about or jogging without a mask, you can get a fine for like jogging in the forest on your own if you're not wearing a mask. And that just seems just outrageous, because if we think about bringing it back to driving, we use like driving is this well understood word, but if you actually think what is driving, it's sitting in a big metal heavy box careering down the road by means of controlled explosions. and if you hit someone, they die. Like, this is not the safest activity in the world, but we do it every day because
there's a famous it's like a pretty funny sketch, isn't it? Like, it's an American sitcom where it's like someone's sitting in that car without a seatbelt on, and they turn the engine on, but they haven't got that seatbelt on. And then the cop comes up to them and goes, "You're not wearing a seatbelt." And he goes, "But what are you talking about? I haven't moved anywhere." And he goes, "Look, if I calculate the If I calculate the the circumference of your tire by by the like distance moved or whatever, then at the rate in which you moved, like in terms of turning on your engine. I've got you moving 150 in a car park. You know what I mean? And it's like of course that's not the case. Like, of course they're not moving 150 miles an hour, and it may very well may be that they accelerated that quickly, that they did actually move that speed to move like an inch. But obviously, there's a difference between traveling 150 miles an hour through the car park than actually just turning your engine on. Like, obviously, there is a distinction there. And obviously, we can talk about what is the rational codification of laws. And sometimes laws are irrational and they're badly codified. But one of the main reasons is the lack of democracy in relation to the ways that the laws are made. But ultimately, as long as we could say that we understand the reasons behind the laws and that the enforcement of the laws obviously relates to not just the enforcers, but obviously a judicial body which could judge whether they have been enforced correctly or not, and whether it respects the spirit of the law, then I don't really have that much of an issue.
Right.
So, like, if you're caught not wearing a mask in the woods, I think chances are, if you got to court, they'll go like, "Look, you weren't endangering public safety. We're not going to fine you." That's not what the spirit of that law was. You might find a judge is an arsehole, but like it unfortunately it happens. But like, obviously, this is why you have like obviously that level of judiction to judge whether the law was being met or not.
Definitely. Has anyone got any more questions, or should we wrap it up?
Someone had a quick question for me, like, do I have a method to judge when taking a risk with violation of human life? Basically, I would say that that in terms of risk-taking activities, I would say that it should be institutional, understanding what risks are justified or not in relation to our laws and institutional environments. I would say that it should all exist institutionally, that individuals are very much acting in caprice if they make these decisions by themselves, which is, I would say, an issue with the Kantian perspective and the utilitarian perspective, and that we need institutionalization to understand basically right and wrong, good and bad in general. And so in terms of like justification, in terms of risk, it would be the same. And I think in terms of methodology that our institutions should use, I think that I don't agree with Maximin reasoning, and I do need to do more research on there's a specific kind of theory in relation to judgments in risk taking, and then I needed to actually ask Rem for the recommendation. So I'm gonna have to double check what book he recommended, but I'll get back to you after I've got like a specific standardized theory of like how to outline risks and how our institutions should be approaching risks. But right now, I would say that engage in discourse, civil discourse, in relation to the expression of subjectivity within our ethical institutions, especially that in relation to like law and justice. So yeah.
Cool, man.
But
well,
yeah, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, if there's no more questions, I might go and get some dinner.
yeah, man. I'm probably gonna shoot off myself after I say goodbye to the stream. So, again, thank you everyone. I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you Arthuria for letting me participate. So yeah, it's been good.
Awesome, man. Great talking to you. So I'm gonna shoot off, and I'll let you finish your stream.
Yeah, take it easy, man. Bye.
See you later, man. Bye.
Here, guys. Thank you again.
Take it easy, man. Okay, so I hope you've all enjoyed this stream. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know, obviously, what you thought of it in the chat. Yeah. Basically, yeah, I think it was an interesting discussion anyway. So I'm actually going to shoot straight off this time. And I'm not going to be going like Q&A, since we've had like a little Q&A session. So I do hope everyone's enjoyed it. And so if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing if you'd like to see more content like this. And also, thank you to Ethan Pollitt on Patreon for supporting this stream. If you would like to become a patron on Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description, where there are some pretty cool perks in relation to the YouTube live streams, Discord perks, and yeah, and even one-on-one conversations with myself. So yeah, check that out if you're interested. Thank you all for watching, and remember to try and gain some perspective.